Well, good morning again, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you are recaffeinated and rejuvenated after what's already been a fascinating morning. And I hope that we can continue that spirit with what I think is going to be a really exciting panel. It's looking really at the question of misinformation. I'm Matt Damkona. I'm an editor at Tortoise, and this is something that's sort of interested me for quite a long time as a subject. And I think what's interesting about it is if you go back to the roots of the kind of the interest in post-truth and fake news and misinformation, they go back to around 2016 and Trump's victory in Brexit, and we all hoped that things would get better. And in some respects they have, but there is also, as we can see, some interesting mutations, the growth of conspiracy theory, the growth of the anti-vax movement. And someone in the UK government said to me, you should all have stopped worrying about what happened in 2016 and worried more about what's going to happen in 2020, referring to the US presidential elections and the prospect for misinformation, manipulation, and even information and electoral interference by foreign powers. So there's a whole series of issues to be debated, and we won't cover them all in the 45 minutes we have allotted, but I'm hoping, given the glittering panel we've got, we can at least touch on some of them and try and tease out some of the practical answers to how and what we can do to address this continuing problem. Basha Cummings, my fellow editor, is running the chat, another person that's very au fait with this issue. So please do pop in there and add your comments, and we'll try to come to as many of you as we can in order to enrich the conversation, because there are so many fascinating perspectives here. I'd like to start, if I may, just dive straight in with someone who, I mean, it is cliche to say it needs no introduction, but Jimmy Wales, who founded Wikipedia, is the man. We go to his service online to find out information when we're going to introduce other people, which I think is a pretty kind of impressive credential. He's also the founder, in this context, of something I greatly admire, which is Wiki Tribune, which has, really, I think, made a muzzle velocity attempt to back evidence-based journalism in the face of this threat. So Jimmy, welcome, and thank you for doing this. And
thank you.
Can you, I mean, first of all, can you give us a kind of sit rep of where you think we are, and then maybe specifically say a little bit about what Wiki Tribune does and how, as a non-state actor, it's trying to address the problem?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think where we are, well, I could speak for an hour on where we are and how we got here, but I feel like, one of the things that I think we have to identify is something that I always say, which is like the business model drives incentives and drives results. And so right now we have a social media environment that is advertising based, advertising only based. And just as I think many people will agree that the advertising only business model for journalism was fairly disastrous, it's also fairly disastrous in the context of social media, i.e. the platform that drives traffic also being purely advertising driven, because the content that works in that context is really things that tempt us to click, that keep us outraged, keep us addicted, and so on and so forth. And I think human beings don't necessarily want that. You want it, it's sort of like the difference between your reptilian brain and your Aristotelian brain. You click on things because they're in front of you and they're tempting and they're outraging or they're interesting or whatever. But actually the shift that we're seeing that I'm really excited to see is that people are beginning to reject that as the sole business model for journalism and say, you know what, actually, I should pay for Tortoise, I should pay for the New York Times, I should pay for things that I believe in. But obviously that brings a lot of challenges as well. So what I'm trying to do with the Wiki Tribune social model is to say, okay, what has worked for Wikipedia, which of course is imperfect, but I think most people will agree has done a pretty decent job. I mean, you won't find 5G coronavirus conspiracy theories promoted on Wikipedia. Like the Wikipedians would just delete it and ban you instantly if you tried it. And one of the reasons is that as an organization, the Wikimedia Foundation has no incentive to get as many clicks as possible or as many page views as possible. That isn't what we're about. What we're about, because our business model as a charity is different. It's not just that we're a charity, it's that our business model is you only pay if you want to. And so why would you pay unless you see the little, sometimes it's my picture, thank goodness, not as much as it used to be, but the little banner that says, please cough up some money for Wikipedia. And people do because they're like, you know what, this is meaningful to me. This has changed my life in a positive way. I'm willing to chip in a few quid to support this. And that's a very different incentive for the organization. We have to make sure people love Wikipedia, that they care about it, that they cherish it, not that they are tempted to click as many times as possible. So what I'm doing with WikiTribune Social is saying, let's build a social network around quality information that isn't about getting you addicted. It isn't about maximizing your time on the site. It's about giving you an experience that at the end of a year, you'll go, you know what, actually that was meaningful. That improved my life. I won't say that we've created that yet. We're still a pilot project. We're iterating constantly, exploring new ideas and new things. But I do think that there's something in it. There's something in it to say, you know what, let's throw aside some old business models that aren't working because we know where we end up. We end up in a very poisonous place with disinformation and so on. And let's try some new models that I think the public is ready for. They're like, you know what, we're on these platforms because they're paying them. And so I think that that's the opportunity.
Jimmy, thank you. We will return to you very soon. I'd like to welcome Minister Audrey Tang, who is the Digital Minister of Taiwan and has a fascinating insight into all of this, which is partly, hello, Audrey, how are you? Good to see you. Thank you very much for doing this. And as you can see from the elaborate device we're using to contact the minister, it isn't always straightforward to do this kind of event. So we're very grateful to you for this. Yeah. I mean, having talked to Jimmy about if you like a really classic example of the web trying to heal itself. I'm very interested if you could say a little bit about what's going on in Taiwan, because a lot of people have drawn attention to what's going on there in the battle against disinformation specifically, as a kind of fascinating third way between the kind of fake news chaos of America, if you will, and the state-based surveillance model of China. And that you specifically have been fostering the use of tech, but with government encouragement to address this. Can you walk us through some of the techniques that you've been using and how business and entrepreneurs and government can collaborate against disinformation?
Certainly, really happy to speak through this analog loophole to you as the digital minister. And in Taiwan, we rely on what we call the social sector. We don't call them charities. We see them as the social sector that balances and in fact has better legitimacy than either the state-based as public sector or the capitalism approach that's the private sector. So in Taiwan, the social sector does something that's roughly modeled after what Spam House did for Spam way back when, which is basically people voluntarily flagging things that they think that are traveling on outrage, that may be disinformation, in even end-to-end encrypted channels such as Line, which is the equivalent of WhatsApp here. And once people phone press that message and flag it as spam, basically, it donates the fingerprint of that particular message into a network called the International Fact-Checking Network. And Taiwan has multiple social sector members, such as the Taiwan Fact-Check Center and Michael Penn and things like that, who will then, within hours nowadays, and just to push out a clarification. And this is a model that we call notice and public notice. The idea is that just as we fight a pandemic very successfully, eliminating it actually for a few months now, with no lockdown, we fight an infodemic with no takedowns, with no administrative takedown. And the key insight here is that the social sector, when empowered with the wisdom of the crowd, can do this collective intelligence and detect a trending rumor far before it actually goes to the more advertisement-based social media when it was still in the end-to-end encrypted channels. And the public authorities basically rolls out funny dog memes and things like the spokesdog Zong Chai of our Ministries of Health and Welfare that always is very funny. And this we call it humor over rumor, because when a disinformation travels outrage movie has a R0 value of 3, that is to say every hour one person shared to every 3 other people. But if working with fact-checking organizations, we can get a very funny meme within a couple of hours that has a higher R value of maybe 5, then actually people who feel joy and humor is vaccinated against outrage. And then people can become more pro-social, even on the more anti-social, multinational social media. So that's one part of the playbook. The other part, of course, is transparency and accountability, especially during elections. And we managed to convince Facebook and friends to adhere to our local norm, which is either to make the raw data accessible for all the targeted advertisements during elections that concern social issues, or just stop running them altogether during our elections. We did that last year.
So at no point in the process did you think, well, what we really need is a sweeping, heavy-handed regime of regulation? I mean, it's clear from what you're saying, it seems to me that it's a much more subtle and nuanced culture of not control, but of driving bad information out.
Exactly, and this is in the, I think the UN high-level digital forum parlance, this is called CoGov, right, collaborative governance. And just like we never passed any law about spam, by the way, back in the spam wars, and we rely instead, of course, on all our, mail providing services adhering to the spam house protocol. Misinformation is just like spam, but with a higher forward rate. And so we basically tackle it the same way, which is not through a heavy-handed regulation, but by empowering social sector in our K-12 curriculum, emphasize not media literacy. We remove that word from our curriculum. We replace it with media competence. That is to say, every primary school children learn to become a accountable, like an amateur journalist, producing, curating their own data, narratives, and stories.
Thank you very much, Minister. We'll return to you. And I'd like to bring in Farah Pandit, if I may, who, can we get Farah on screen? Farah is a person of huge distinction and expertise, long-time advisor to the US Department of State. And it's pretty hard to find an important international organization with which she doesn't have some association. So I hope she'll forgive me if I don't list them all, but they include Harvard Kennedy School and the Council on Foreign Relations. And if you're interested in this theory, I heartily recommend, in this subject, I heartily recommend her book of a couple of years ago, How We Win, which really does get into the details of the strategy that needs to be adopted. But Farah, what I wanted to ask specifically, I guess from the US angle, but also looking at it supranationally, is how great do you think the damage done by the pincer movement, if you like, of the Russian strategy of troll farms and then the debasing of evidence-based government and indeed the whole concept of truth by the Trump administration has been. You know, we can say what we will about them, but what's the impact been on us and on the ecology of information?
Well, first of all, thank you all so much. I'm really happy to be part of this prestigious panel. I think that there's a real value in taking a step back toward the end of what you said. What is the consciousness for all of us as humans on planet Earth? I mean, really, truly, what has happened to us since the 2016 election in the United States, where 40% of the voters, adult voters in the United States, went to fake websites for both Clinton and for Trump? There is a change in the way in which we think about ourselves and what we value. And those values, societal values, have shifted, which allows us to see trust in a new way, to think about fact and freedom of speech and all of these things that have been intermingled. It isn't just about a Russian troll farm. It is not just about a terrorist organization that are using these tools and manipulating them to get into the minds of Generation Z, millennials, and now Generation Alpha. But it is the compounded effect on all of this, on all of us. And so one of the things that I talk about both in How We Win and, you know, just since that time is what is the system that is underlying all of this? What's actually having an effect? It isn't just bad actors who are trying their best to get the better of us, which is what bad actors do, whether they're child predators, sexual predators, or they're terrorists, or their political adversaries. This is something much larger that we're seeing in real time, obviously here in the United States, not just about this election and what people believe in terms of science, in terms of American values, but it has absolutely shifted, I think, the way Americans absorb who we are as Americans and what we want to be. So these are large, large issues that I fear we're not going to be able to navigate through, certainly in the course of this pandemic environment, because the stakes are too high around elections and around health. And I loved what the minister was saying about the way in which they're teaching the young generation to take responsibility over who they are and what they absorb. There hasn't been that kind of conversation at the government level here in the United States in any administration. I mean, I think that hygiene, that technology hygiene, that human consciousness, that decision that adults need to make about how we want to raise our community, our children and the communities going forward are large sort of soft, gushy things that government doesn't do very well. And so then you look at the social sectors to say, can you help us with this? And there's a push and tug because it's become political. So I'm actually extremely surprised that in the context of the last 6 months where Americans have been at home only absorbing what they see on their screens, that there hasn't been more of a forward lean toward rebooting the way in which we think about human societies vis-a-vis misinformation.
Thank you so much, Farah. I'm very glad that Anne Applebaum is able to join us after a little bit of technical difficulty. It's always good to see you, Anne. And for those who, I'm sure you've all familiar with Anne's work, but she's a Pulitzer Prize winner and very distinguished woman of letters whose most recent book, Twilight of Democracy, is really fascinating on the politics of the last 20 or 30 years and what happened. And I guess drawing into that, Anne, can you say, you know, with regards to where we were at on misinformation, perhaps a little bit about the role that conspiracy theory and its prevalence and its cultural power has played in this? Because we always look at this in terms of bad actors, but there is also a consumption question here and an appetite question, isn't there?
Yes, well, thank you, and apologies for the late joining. I'm actually doing this off tethering on my phone as I've had catastrophic internet failure, so we'll see how well it works. You know, I mean, look, I think we all underestimated the power of conspiracy theories not only as a thing that attracts people or leads them to gossip, but as a way of organizing society. One of the really important things that Donald Trump did in the run-up to the election in 2016 was become the public face of the birtherist campaign in the United States, namely the theory that Donald Trump was an illegitimate, that Barack Obama was an illegitimate president, that he wasn't born in America and therefore he had no right to be president. Something like 25 to 30% of Americans eventually came to believe that. And if you think about what that means that 25 to 30% of Americans think the president is illegitimate, and that therefore the Congress, the Senate, the courts, the media, the bureaucracy, the police are all covering up this essential fact about the American president, and they're all lying to us. And this prepared them to accept a very different kind of presidency and a very different kind of political campaign. I mean, once you believe that everything around you, all the institutions are false and deceptive, then you can accept a much more radical form of politics. And the influence and power of conspiracy theories and the use of them as a political tool, and in particular the way in which they can be so quickly and easily fed and spread across the internet, I think was something that we all missed or misunderstood in the initial enthusiasm about the online world, and particularly about social media in the very beginning. But I'd like to pick up on something that a couple of panelists, I think Jimmy and Audrey, have also referred to, which is what one of the solutions to this problem might be. Because one of the instincts that we all have, or many people have, is to treat this problem of conspiracy theories like, we can just ban them, or we can have, I don't know, policemen on Facebook who read through everything and then find ways of eliminating conspiracy theories. And both of them were moving in a more interesting direction, which is, how do we create an internet? How do we create forms of social media in which these kinds of theories spread more slowly, are less popular, aren't favored by the algorithms because they're so extreme and exciting and frightening? Is there a way that we could create a kind of public service internet for the future, or a public service form of social media, which instead of favoring outrage and instead of using secretive algorithms that manipulate us in order to make more money for Facebook, is there a form of social media that favors better speech or better argument or more literate debate? And I think that's really, really important task, not just, for the next US administration, but for the West as a whole. I mean, look, we all know that the Chinese have now created a Chinese internet, which has the values of China's authoritarian system built into it, and makes it possible for China to censor people in the way it wants. What does a democratic internet look like? In other words, what does an internet look like that favors better conversation, that has transparent algorithms, that works for us as societies, and not just for advertisers? I mean, we haven't really even begun to have that conversation yet, and that's the kind of conversation that we need to have if we don't want our societies to be run by or manipulated by conspiracy theorists, whether it's conspiracies about the deep state, or whether it's conspiracies about 5G causing the pandemic. This is we have all around us, like there are these screaming alarms going off, as Farah just said, telling us that there's a deep problem, that the internet is changing our behavior, is promoting the worst parts of human nature over the better parts, and yet we still haven't had the nerve to sit down and say, okay, what is it that we want it to look like? This is not just about censoring Facebook. What do we want the internet to do? How do we want it to help us to make our societies work better?
Thank you so much, Anne. I'd like to come to Nupa now, who I think has a very interesting question for Jimmy. Nupa, do we have you there? There you are.
Yes,
hello.
Hello, I was a little bit taken aback. You might have seen my kitchen in the background. Forgive me for that. I was really interested in picking up what you were just saying. And we started by talking about the sort of collective responsibility, what was called the social, the sort of charity sector in Taiwan, and young individuals taking responsibility for themselves, which I think is hugely important, but only one part of the answer. And I know this is very topical, but I would really like to ask the panel, what responsibility or what more responsibility do you think the social media platforms must take for disseminating the truth, even if they aren't the originators of their own content, and to act more like newspapers and publishers are, who are quite heavily regulated on that point?
Thank you, Deborah. Jimmy, would you like to answer that one first, if you're there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a few elements of this that are very complicated. So first of all, I think there are no magic bullets where we can just say to Facebook, stop letting people share misinformation. That doesn't really work, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. If this is a fictional person, I don't actually have a crazy uncle, but the crazy uncle metaphor. If my crazy uncle wants to share his crazy stuff, it's not really for Facebook to get involved. That's a family conversation, and we can shut that down. Where I do think they have a responsibility is around their algorithmic promotion of things. And so, to the extent that sort of people have weird ideas, don't want to talk to their friends about weird ideas, it's a platform. That's what people are going to do. It's been true of every platform ever. The difference is that, if you sign up for, and YouTube has been criticized for this, and they're working hard on it, I'm sure all of these people are working hard on it. If you sign up for YouTube and you just start accepting all the recommendations and you get driven down a path of conspiracy theories, that's a problem. That's a quality problem for those companies. It's not good. I harken back to the question of whether an advertising-only business model actually, it makes it very hard for them to fix that problem, because if that is actually the algorithm that works to maximize ad revenue, they're not going to be able to stop it. I mean, they may try and they may be tempted to, but it's hard to really have your heart in it if the money's not there. I'm not convinced that that's an intractable problem, but I think it's something that has to be grappled with. I think it's a mistake, though, as soon as we start bringing in the analogy and say, oh, Facebook should be treated just like a newspaper, that's really dangerous ground. If we begin to make open platforms like Wikipedia, for example, legally liable for things that people do on the platform, then we kind of have to stop letting people express themselves. And I think that's a huge negative and a huge cost. And so I think we should kind of put aside that kind of language and recognize actually a social network is definitely not a newspaper. It's a place where ordinary people can come and say what they think. By the way, that's not true at Wikipedia. You can't just come on Wikipedia and say whatever you think. But in a general social network, that is true. And I just think we have to be very careful with that kind of framework for our thinking. And that's all I have.
I think we might have lost Matt there for a moment.
Oh, I see, he's frozen.
He's frozen. So why don't we come, I see in the chat that Jenny King has just made a fantastic point about a common framework for what citizenship means in the digital space. Jenny, would you be happy to jump on and talk to us about what you mean with that comment?
Hi everyone, I'll keep my video off because I'm also trying to use mobile phone Wi-Fi. But the question I asked was building on the great point made about digital competence. And in the workplace, I work for the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and we talk about digital citizenship. And part of that is that there doesn't seem to be a common framework or a set of collective norms about what citizenship means in the online space. And if we have specific things, Not everyone might do them, but there is at least some sort of consensus of what it means offline to be part of society. You might vote, you might pay your taxes, you might not commit crimes, you might care about your neighborhood. But despite how long the internet has been part of our lives and how important it is to our professional and personal and social spheres and our formation of identity, we don't seem to have a parallel understanding of the actual behaviors and types of action that would be required to be a citizen in digital spaces. So I was wondering, both in the Taiwan context and the curriculum that they've developed, but also for the other panelists, how they think that could be crowdsourced, co-developed and established across various different societies.
I think that's a great point. Audrey, perhaps you'd like to jump in here and respond.
So in Taiwan, we have this term called 功德心, which has its equivalents in Japanese and Korean, but it's very difficult to translate. I think on Wikipedia, it's translated as civic virtue, but the term virtue in English has taken a very different meaning from what it used to take. So I'm not even sure whether it's translatable. But the main idea is pretty close to actually the African concept of Ubuntu, meaning that each individual is a piece of the puzzle and we complete the epistemic journey only by complementing each other's knowledge. That's like actualizing the community is the road to self-actualization. I think that's what Ubuntu means. And so I think having that norm is important because we see Facebook as a governor, if not sovereign, probably not sovereign. They're not printing their money yet. And so because of that, we, like any trade negotiation, we're saying, you know, you have to adhere to our election campaign donation expense rules and banning foreign sponsored propaganda. Otherwise, you may face sanctions from our society because you violated our 功德心, and you have to do a notice and public notice so that when there was a trending disinformation right before our election that says, and I quote, Hong Kong sucks, compensation exposed, killing a police earns those young people up to 20 million. The Taiwan Fact Check Center very quickly found out the photo, which was actually a Reuters photo, but the original caption says nothing about being paid or anything like that. It was a adversarial modification of the caption that talks about, you know, buying iPhones and recruiting his younger brother. And because we don't do administrative takedowns at all, and we have to respond within a couple of hours, so the notice and public notice is very simple. Anyone who sees this altered caption on Facebook see that this message originates from the Weibo account of the Chinese Communist Party, Strong Zhenfawei Chang'an Jian, the Chang'an Sword, the central political and law unit of the Tang, the party. And so that is basically, instead of takedown, making sure that people are aware of the narratives. And that is the part of 功德心 that I was talking about. That is to say, people voluntarily fact-checking during our presidential platforms and debates, and also voluntarily doing this kind of attribution tracking to its sources.
Thank you, Audrey. I wonder if we sort of look forward, and I come to you, Anne, because I've been reading your book, and it's such a fantastic, you know, look at how a country has shifted over time, and how, you know, that scene that you paint at the beginning about the party in your house, and how so many of those people are now on completely a different side of the political divide in Poland. But if we look at the situation in America, obviously what's on many of our minds is what's going to happen in November. Could you just talk about how you see the role of misinformation and conspiracy theories now playing a role in what we think we might see over the next couple of months?
So we are about to see something in the United States that we've never seen before in a democratic country, namely an election campaign which is going to be run, you know, entirely on the basis of a false picture of the world. So in order to win, the Trump campaign thinks that it needs to create an absolutely alternative version of reality, one in which America's fight against the pandemic was a 100% success, in which our victory over the virus was complete, in which America came out of this crisis better than anyone else, in which there is no economic crisis of any significance. Some people lost their jobs, but now the jobs have been won back again. In which the real threat to America is a radical far left led by 77-year-old Joe Biden, which is seeking to take away your suburban house and burn it to the ground. And if that sounds like I'm exaggerating, please have a look at Trump campaign advertising, because that is the kind of message and the kind of language that you see. And it's being backed up with video, with testimony, with real looking footage of horrible events that are happening somewhere in America and will be multiplied and will come and harm you and your family if Joe Biden wins. And of course, because this is a false picture of reality, it has to be created on the internet, because the internet is where you can create alternate realities. I said recently to a friend of mine who follows American political campaigns and history, I said, well, isn't this a completely bizarre way to run a campaign? And he said, well, have you got a better idea? I mean, this is what they think is their best shot to win, and this is how they're going to try and do it. And the reason why they do have a chance is that I think we've all neglected the way in which, everybody likes to say, well, look at the internet and look at reality and look at the contrast between what you see in this video clip and what you see outside your window. I think the point is that the internet has become reality for a lot of people, and there isn't a difference between what's online and what's in real life. They're somehow integrated, and they feel in your brain, they're all the same thing. And therefore, it is now possible to create false pictures of the world. The U.S. election campaign is going to be, an experiment and an example of how that power works. And this, by the way, is why I really, really like the comment about online citizenship. Beginning to think harder about how we transfer the values that we've concluded are the best ones for citizens in real life, and how we move those online. And incorporate them somehow into the way that social media works, or the way the rules of the internet work, or the way transparency works online. The more difficult it will be to create this false picture and this alternate reality in the world. But it's, watch the US elections very carefully, because it is going to be an experiment in misinformation that we have never seen in a democracy before.
Yes. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, James Harding, because I think Matt is having some trouble rejoining us. So James will take over the hosting, and I'll jump back into the chat. I'm sorry for the shift around. James.
Thanks, Basha. I'm sure there's something going on here, isn't there, Anne? Because both you and Matt have been assaulted by the dark forces of the internet. It must be we're getting closer to the truths that cannot be heard. But Anne, can I just follow up on what you're saying? Because I'm really struck listening to Audrey Tang about Gondoshin and the idea of a notion of civility, a notion of the public square. When you started just then, and I'm going to put this point to you and to Farah, in fact, you said, this is the first time a US presidential election, and I thought you were going to say, this is the first time a US presidential election is going to be conducted almost entirely online, as in, to a certain extent, the sort of, if you like, the kind of the street campaign, the rallies, all of that are held at bay by COVID. And so more than ever, we are subject to what happens in the information marketplace. And I just wondered whether you're thinking about how we are proactive in setting the terms of that information marketplace rather than reactive is changing. What you think government should be doing to set the rules of the public square in a digital world. I'm going to ask Farah essentially to follow up with the same question. So I want to know constructively how you would go about doing this, Anne.
So we're really just at the beginning of this process. We're at the stage of politicians beginning to understand the nature of the problem. You can see, for example, the comparison of Mark Zuckerberg's first testimony before Congress, when he was asked all kinds of stupid questions. And then more recently, you see a more sophisticated debate. I mean, the first thing that has to happen is that our political leaders, and I would say in the US, but also across Europe and the democratic world, need to focus on this as a problem. I mean, it is extraordinary to me that it's happened in Taiwan. I mean, we hear from Audrey Tang that there is, you know, that the discussion of this problem is so far advanced, and yet it really hasn't happened in the countries that invented many of these technologies in the first place, including the United States. So, I mean, really, at the beginning, we have to raise awareness that this is a problem. I mean, and then there needs to be, you know, a moment where we put everything on the table and we say, not how do we want to ban stuff from Facebook, but how do we want the rules to be written? What are the underlying, what are the things that are determining how people do and don't see things? You know, how much anonymity do we want on the internet? How much, or parts of it? Do we want that to be confined to certain areas? How much transparency do we want? Do we want people to be able to see where a website was created and who its creators were and at what time? You know, begin to ask very basic questions about how it's structured and what values it now embodies.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting this, because we always think we're facing unprecedented problems, but you know, the world or society, even Western society, dealt with this with the printing press and John Wilkes. We dealt with it with broadcasting technologies and regulation and licensing. They're clearly trade-offs, but it is possible. I'm fascinated by how we go about it. Farah, you've dealt with some of these kinds of issues, the intersection between government and big changes in society. How do you think you can incentivize organizations to behave differently?
Well, I want to say a couple of things. One is QAnon has not been mentioned yet today. And we're living in a moment where it's seizing people's brains in a way no one could have imagined. They thought it was all kooky stuff, but it's in the mainstream. And when conspiracy becomes mainstream, it doesn't seem so strange that you're looking at one thing or another. So one very specific thing, and I have two other points to make, is the consciousness level that I raised before. The societal sinkholes have been exposed. It isn't, we're not back in 2001. We are on the 19th anniversary week of 9/11, when we still have people in the world today that believe that 9/11 didn't happen. I mean, 19 years later, this is still living in our world. People thought it was a faked, thing. And as you said, James, we have conspiracy theories about UFOs and the JFK assassination and all kinds of things. So this is not going away. So the first point is, what can we do to expose society to the real world effects of what's happening? And I don't mean article after article, with all due respect to my friends who write, but I mean really truly explaining to someone in a way that is culturally adaptive what is happening to them, that this is an AI model and this is a real person. You're not living in a game. We've got to figure out a way to make that mainstream and not just a conversation that's happening in Wired magazine or somewhere else. So we've got a mainstream. Secondly, I want to go back to a point that was about government and what government can do. Look, government has been talking to tech companies for a very long time. I hate to say this to you, and I'm going to be very unpopular, but I don't have very much confidence anymore in the ability for technology companies to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. You've got to incentivize them. And so I've come out with what government must do, which includes in the US context, tax incentives to get them to think differently. If you're waiting for Mr. Zuckerberg to wake up one day and become a different kind of person, it's not going to happen. We waited, we begged, we cajoled, we brought people into the White House, we brought people to the State Department, we went all over the world asking them, and to be fair to them, they have put some money into this idea of misinformation and what we can do better. And obviously, from my perspective, working on how terrorists use this framework to do the evil that they do, they have done some very good things, but the scale's not there. And what I don't get is how these little things, that these dances around the edges, is not going to get us where we need to be. We've got to go all in. We've got to scale things up. And the only way to do that is to give them incentives where they're going to do it the way any other business will do it. And then, I'm sorry, James.
Sorry, I was about to interrupt you. Far away.
Just the third point, and this is obviously the most obvious component, and Anne mentioned this in terms of what's happening here in the United States. Either the US becomes a country where we become lemmings, and we allow somebody else to drive what it is we think is important, how we live our lives, or we stand up and say, this isn't the direction we want to go. And if we wait for government to tell us that, we'll be waiting a long time. So what do we need to do? I mentioned before that we've got to rethink the generational component. I saw in the chat that some people said, but Gen Z and millennials, they're very tech savvy. There is a difference between being tech savvy and understanding how you're being manipulated. There are two different pieces to that. It took a long time for us to understand that when a woman was on the front page, a front cover of Vogue magazine, she had been really changed before she got there. So I would say my overarching thing is be strong, be bold, and go all in. Yeah. And those are three ways in which you can do it.
I have to confess, Farah, one of my big and sort of chilling moments of the last year was when Mark Zuckerberg came out and said, we want regulation. The reason why I was chilled by that was it suggested to me that he knew something that we were only beginning to realize, which was that, to Anne's point, the political world was only just beginning to think about how to deal with this, and it would be a long, long time coming. Forgive me, it sounded as though someone was typing. My colleagues at Tortoise have messaged me, and I've been holding my hand up to show that it wasn't me, because I'm a notoriously loud banger of the keyboard. But I'm going to finish up, if I might, just going back to Jimmy, just because Jimmy Wells and I took a walk. Now and again, we go for a walk wherever we are, and I remember him once explaining to me the secret source of Wikipedia, which was about the incentives for the community, for the Wikipedians, to actually make sure that the truth out, so as close as we can get to it, at least facts. And so I wonder how you think about this, Jimmy, just if you think about it, how you incentivize individuals to make sure that factual information is surfaced and misleading information is either denied or disregarded.
Well, I mean, it's a complicated question. Before I say that, I just want to say quickly, my big alarm bell when Mark Zuckerberg said we would welcome regulation is anytime I see a very large and dominant organization welcoming regulation, I think often they're entrenching their near monopoly. And that can be very problematic, regulatory capture, and assuming that these huge organizations that we have now are the ones we're destined to have forever. Okay, that's not what you asked.
No, but a very good point. Yeah.
I mean, I think with the way Wikipedia works, it's all internally very transparent. People can see other people and what they're doing. They build a reputation within the community for being good Wikipedians. They want to live up to that. We have a culture internally that's really focused on trying to get it right, and we're very far from perfect. And there are a lot of problems. Someone in the chat was asking me about Catalan Wikipedia as an example. And that's an interesting example, because that's one of the areas where it can be quite tricky, because if everyone speaking Catalan tends to have a same sort of bias, then that can leak into the content contrary to each other, and they may not even see that sort of bias. But in general, if somebody comes to Wikipedia and starts to post 5G coronavirus conspiracy theories linking to fake news sites, the community just shuts that stuff down immediately. Like, that's bonkers, and nobody's really interested in that. So it really is about reputation internally, about people caring, about people having a stable identity, maybe not their real life identity. Many Wikipedians are somewhat anonymous, but we generally know who they are. But it's about a stable identity over time. And one of the biggest problems with a lot of platforms, like Twitter, for example, is throwaway accounts. So people come in, create an account, post some obnoxious things or some viral whatever, and then vanish. That's a huge problem. And we don't really have that problem in Wikipedia because people do have a stable identity over time and they build a reputation, but it's not an algorithmic reputation. No, we're not going around with number badges of how trusted we are. It's just like in any organization, you get to know people and you go, oh, okay, well, that's New York Brad. He's weighed in on this. I can just leave us aside because he's a fantastic Wikipedian.
You can trust them. But Jimmy, it's so interesting just listening to you. I think to myself, how we restore that age-old link between reputation and responsibility, that business of trust is so central to this, and I suppose is the theme that's run through the conversation that you and Farah and Anne and Audrey have had. So I know that we could really go on for this, and particularly with me, who, as you know, is not great on timekeeping and is the sort of obsessive about this subject, we could really ruin the rest of the day. So I just want to sort of call a halt because we're about to go into the next session, which is called The Deal on Debt. And my colleague Alexi Mostras is chairing it. The weird thing about 2020 is that I think for many of us, it's been a year in which we've been radicalized. Part of it I confess, in anger, outraged at what we're seeing, but part of it too in a sense of possibility. And one of the areas of this is debt. You suddenly think, well, hang on, if governments can borrow, what could they borrow for? Lingering behind that question is always, and then how is it going to be paid back? So my colleague Alexi is going to try and navigate that. So I'm going to bring this to a close, invite everyone to join us again in 10 minutes time when Alexi will reopen to host that discussion on debt. But for now, we can't applaud you, but trust me, we are applauding you. A big thank you to Anne Applebaum, to Farah Pandit, to Audrey Tang, and to Jimmy Wales. On behalf of all of us, we'll give you a thankful wave. Goodbye, but thank you very much for joining us. And everyone do stay on and keep with us through the day. Much appreciated.